All right, we're about to dive into a really provocative analysis of the relationship between the US, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. It's a perspective that's designed to challenge pretty much everything we think we know about allies, oil, and power. So, let's just get right into it.
So, the source material kicks things off with a huge, and honestly, a pretty unsettling question. It asks us to look past all the gleaming skyscrapers and the incredible wealth, and really question the very foundation of independence for these Gulf nations. Are they really in control? And boom, there it is. This is the core argument of the entire analysis. It frames the whole relationship not as some partnership of equals, but as a performance, a grand illusion of sovereignty, where the real power, the director, is sitting thousands of miles away in Washington. Okay, so let's unpack what the source actually means by this curated theater. We're going to start by defining the key concept that really holds this entire argument together. The first thing the analysis says is to forget those old black and white images of colonialism. This isn't about planting flags or installing governors anymore. It's about a much more modern system, neo-colonialism, where a country has its own flag, it has a seat at the UN, but its most critical decisions, well, they're effectively being steered by another power. And right away, here's the first big twist the analysis throws at us. The fundamental idea is this. We shouldn't see Saudi Arabia and the UAE as simple partners of the United States, but more like strategic outposts, operating inside a much larger American global system. Now, according to the source, this dependency didn't just happen by accident. It was built, piece by piece, through a few key historical moments. It really starts back in 1945 with something called the Quincy Pact, basically a security for oil deal to protect the Saudi monarchy. Then, fast forward in 1971, the British leave the region and the US steps right in to fill that power vacuum. And all of this leads to the 1974 Petrodollar deal, which is a really big deal. We'll get into that next.
So let's switch gears and talk about the economic pillar of this argument, which the source calls, pretty vividly, the petrodollar cage. This is all about financial control. Okay, so the 1974 deal was crucial, and it had two main parts. First, all oil had to be sold for US dollars. This is huge because it keeps global demand for the dollar super high. Second, all those massive profits, the petrodollars, had to be recycled right back into the US economy, mostly by buying American debt. And that brings us to what the analysis calls its most shocking economic claim. It paints this picture of oil money not as a simple transaction, but as a completely closed loop. The wealth gets pumped out of the ground in the Gulf, it's used to buy oil, and then that same money flows right back to finance the US government. And this isn't just history. The source argues this dependency is getting a 21st century upgrade. It points to these massive tech deals, like this $200 billion investment by the UA, as a new kind of tech colonialism. The goal, it says, is to lock the Gulf into America's technology ecosystem and keep them away from competitors like China. When you lay it all out like this, you can really see the picture the analysis is painting. It's drawing a direct line from those early petrodollars financing U.S. deficits to today's huge investments financing American jobs, all the way to a future where the Gulf's biggest AI ambitions are built entirely on U.S. technology. It's presented as a seamless system of dependency. Okay, now for the military side of things. And, the source uses some really strong language here, framing this whole dimension as the fangs of the colonial beast. The argument here is that the vast network of U.S. military bases you see in the region, like Al Dhafra in the UAE, aren't just there for protection. No, the claim is that they function as instruments of control, a kind of permanent state of occupation that ensures compliance and projects American power 24/7. And if you want to see what the source calls the devastating consequences of this arrangement, it points straight to the war in Yemen. It presents this absolutely staggering number, 377,000 deaths, as the direct human cost of a proxy war waged by Gulf states using American backing and, of course, American weapons. And that human cost? It's directly tied to the money. The analysis makes it very clear that this conflict was fueled by over $100 billion in sophisticated U.S. arms sales. It basically turned the region into a live testing ground for American military hardware. And just to make sure these aren't just abstract numbers on a screen, the source uses specific, absolutely harrowing details like this. The point is to make the consequences of these deals brutally tangible, moving way beyond geopolitics and right down to the impact on individual human lives. So we've covered the economy, we've covered the military. What about the politics? Well, the analysis labels this dimension political puppetry.
and it focuses on how this dependent relationship allegedly shapes foreign policy.
This is maybe the sharpest political critique in the entire analysis. It frames the Abraham Accords, that normalization of relations with Israel, not as some big peace initiative, but as a cold, hard transaction. A trade-off, where decades of support for the Palestinian cause gets exchanged for continued access to advanced U.S. weaponry.
So how is this political alignment kept in place? Well, the analysis points to the money, specifically the immense financial power of the Emirati lobby in Washington. It highlights tens of millions spent to, in the source's words, ward off critics, and just make sure that the flow of weapons continues, no questions asked.
This table really puts the data behind that argument front and center. It connects the humanitarian crisis in Yemen directly to the political machinery in D.C. And it even frames those lobbying dollars as a kind of modern tribute, money paid to an imperial center to keep the policies favorable.
But hold on, the story doesn't just end with total control. In its final section, the analysis explores some recent developments that suggest this long-standing arrangement, well, it might be starting to fray at the edges. And this slide really spells out that shift. You can see the then versus the now. A move away from total U.S. alignment to a new strategy of multi-alignment. Instead of just relying on the U.S. for security, they're hedging their bets with China and Russia. And instead of following the U.S. lead on oil, we're seeing a Saudi-first approach.
And this brings us to the final, really fascinating twist of this whole analysis. The suggestion is that the Gulf states aren't just trying to break free. Instead, they're learning to use the very tools of their dependency, their control over oil prices, their strategic importance, as leverage against Washington.
And so this is where the explainer leaves us, with this one big question. Based on all the evidence it presents, from the economic cages and military occupations to these recent signs of defiance, are the Gulf monarchies destined to be forever dependent? Or are they actually cunning survivors, learning to play a brand new game on the world stage? The source has laid out its argument, and now it leaves that final conclusion up to you.